French gastronomer Jean Savrin, in his very famous treatise, Physiology of Taste, writes, "Tell me what you eat, and I will tell you who you are." And from the history of culinary studies, this aphorism was coined by Jean Savrin in his book, but later this was appropriated by many movements like those who advocate vegetarianism, those who advocate several kind of food cultures have appropriated this particular aphorism. And today, at the 5th edition of Mathrubhumi International Festival of Letters, we are here with three eminent speakers to speak about the topic, what we eat. So food, as we know, it's a biological imperative to have food on a daily basis, but in addition, by consuming food, we are intricately linked with a web of meanings, which are socially, historically, and culturally constituted. By consuming food, we are not only imbibing nutrients, but also imbibing a certain set of values and cultures, which is determined by certain ideologies that is across us. So today, we will be thinking about, we will be speaking about, we will be deliberating on the close associations of food and identity in contemporary cultures. So to begin with, we have Karen ma'am, and to begin with your book, especially the Masala Mem Sab, in which she speaks about different cuisines in India and how the history of India, colonial history of India, cultural history of India has contributed to the formation of certain confluences of different traditions from different parts of the world in developing a special culinary culture in India. So, to begin with, how do you imagine the confluence of different traditions in Indian culinary, ma'am? Indian culinary culture, ma'am?
That sounds very complicated. It's not such a complicated book. It's a very simple book. It's a book I wrote during COVID, and it brings together almost 35 years of my coming back to India. So it's a very special book for me. It's all about memories, it's all about nostalgia, it's all about tradition, it's about authenticity, that word we have to discuss. What is authentic today, what was authentic 30 years ago? So for me, it's a very important book. It's also recipes, Sidharth, from homes. Most of the recipes are from homes. They're not from chefs. They're not from hotels. So there are things that, there is a big chapter on Kerala, as you saw. So there are recipes from Nayar homes, there are recipes from Mopla homes, there are recipes from Syrian Christian friends. So I would like to think they're really home-style cooking and not restaurant-style cooking, which I think is very important to continue the tradition.
So we begin from that note, and we'll move on to yet another important author, Sunita ma'am. She has written more than 2 books, but 2 books are very important for the discussion, I guess. One is the Lucknow Cookbook, which she co-authored with your mom, right ma'am? In that, she discusses about the various cuisines of Lucknow, which were shaped by the influences from Afghan, Turkish, etc. So in this contemporary world where we try to reduce Indian culture into certain monolithic identities, it is very important to think food as a pluralistic cultural product. Because we celebrate pluralism in MBIFL, and there are certain spaces where we can speak about the plural nature of food, especially Indian food, which cannot be reduced into any kind of religious or monolithic cultural entities. So, on that note, ma'am, can you please speak about your 2 books, Lucknow Cookbook and the recent Indian Cookbook?
I think the topic that has been selected, what we eat, is hugely interesting. Because as we all know that today there is built cultural heritage, but equally important is intangible heritage, of which cuisine is a very integral part. So, as is I quote from the Bible, which says, one man's meat is another man's poison. Now, it can be taken in many, many different ways. And also, I would like to stress that food is something that nourishes. And it nourishes, and I take the example of my mother, who you just mentioned, with whom I had co-authored the first of what is the cuisine trilogy. Now these are unplanned books because my profession is architectural conservation and interior design, and I have been in this profession for 52 years. So this happened chalte chalte, these cookbooks. So the second is what was just released, so sorry for coming, by Dr. Shashi Tharoor, for coming a few minutes late. Um, now, I give as an example, say, my mother, who was a brilliant cookbook. She sadly passed away a year and a half ago at the age of 96 and a half. Now, she was a partition survivor. Until the day she died, her skin glowed and was almost like peaches and cream. Now, why would that be happening to a 96 and a half year old woman? The half I'll come to later. So, and that is because of food was treated as to nourish the body, and I think food also nourishes the soul. So we grew up, and this is the way she cooked and served food in the house. Was food that was firstly, organic is a buzzword, but we all grew up with organic food. We all grew up with seasonal food. So food that was always that was always cooked with great. Not only that it should look good, it should be aromatic. I'm speaking about Lucknow, from where I come, but also that it should nourish. So these are the sort of things that align itself with the subject that you have chosen for today's discussion. And if I may, now or later, I'd just like to read a short passage from. Okay. So in the introduction, because these two books, the introductions are like a continuum, because both carry similar ideas. So in this introduction, I have written that food in India is a religion, an identity, a cultural and social signifier beyond the pale of our quest for unity in diversity. The often used phrase fasting and feasting routinely surfaces as a popular ordering principle for a vast and seemingly disparate panoply of taste preferences and food choices. Most communal feasts of all religions in India are followed by a festive feast. Dietary taboos have defined different religions, and food has played an important part in it. Hindus celebrate myriad festivals throughout the year for which various particular savories and sweetmeats are prepared. Similarly, Muslim homes and kitchens have, over the centuries, perfected an aromatic variety of dishes which break the rigorous sunrise to sunset fast during the holy month of Ramzan. Food is an important part of culture and sharing, which is what we've been saying throughout. Food and recipes are about personal histories and collective memories. They are a part of social history. And similarly, the recipes in this book are from school friends to college friends to friends who one has met along the way. And if I come back to my mother, I mean, as I said, my mother is a survivor of partition, and I too myself was born in Lahore but raised in Lucknow after they fled Lahore during the partition. And in that, so when I think about the sort of things that my mother cooked, nothing was ever wasted. In this Lucknow cookbook, there is a recipe called jalebi pudding. And jalebis are something that I would say up in the hills, because in the south you have beaches. In the north during the summer we go up to the hills because it's so hot. And jalebis would be brought for tea, but some jalebis would always be left over. So what did my mother do with that? Mix eggs and milk, etc., and it would become a totally new dish. So nothing was ever wasted. It just continued in a different form. So thinking of my mother and myself, I'm the first generation that grew up in independent India. So in this, as I said, both the introductions in both the books are really continuums. So in the Lucknow cookbook, in my note about the book I had written, David Lowenthal, the American historian, renowned for his work on heritage and spatial concepts of the past and the future, had famously pronounced that, and I quote, past is a foreign country, close quote. This cookbook, although palpable with nostalgia, selectively recaptures events and objects from the past that are a part of the intangible heritage of food and familial memories of gentler times. There are collective memories, these are collective memories that conserve a sense of continuity, of belonging and of being rooted. I believe food engenders social and family harmony. It anchors and connects us to the past, grounds us in the present, and gives us a sense of identity and belonging. Our personal histories define us, and I have chosen to define this partly through Lucknow's food cultures. The preparation of food is learned by observation. It is a process of osmosis. In our family, all 4 generations are reasonably good cooks. And then I end this paragraph by saying that this is a book for cooks and for armchair cooks. Because for people who really love food, it is a lens through which to view this particular world.
Thank you, ma'am, for that insightful excerpt from her book, which we can think about the relationship between partition narratives, food, and also the post-independent India. At the same time, we have another researcher, an assistant professor from Alliance University, who's also a researcher whose area of interest is particularly decolonial studies. I think that that is something that's a entirely different vantage point to look at food from the perspective of decolonial studies. I have gone through your work on decolonizing the food from the Bengali culture. So I think you can speak on a very different perspective about the food.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much for the question. I mean, in fact, I'll slightly disagree with your perspective of, it's a completely different perspective because what I try to look into this dimension of decolonization is how, I mean, specific especially to British colonization in India, because one important element that we see with respect to the history of British colonization in India, they tried to colonize almost every aspect of our existence. I mean, it was not just political aspects. They tried to prove how, in terms of fashion, we are inferior, how, in terms of food and cultural habits, we are inferior, how our foods are not enough palatable to the standard European tastes, and all of these perspectives. And I think what especially Sunita was sharing about the home-cooked foods, I mean, home-cooked foods is actually one of the many ways of resisting these so-called very globally established Indian cuisines. And one of the many problems of the colonial food culture has been, at least to me, with respect to my little bit of work, whatever I have done so far, is this extravagant fetishism towards authentic Indian foods. I mean, whenever I travel outside India somewhere, and when I look at an authentic Indian restaurant, I always give a sly smile to myself, like, what is authentic Indian food? I mean, what exactly is Indian food? Can we just assimilate a whole concept of Indian food at all, where we have so many diverse layers and perspectives and sub-layers? Like, even if we just talk about a Malayali cuisine, I mean, I just can't pick up 4 and 5 items and tell that this is just what represents a Malayali cuisine, right? Like, there are so many layers and sub-layers. Now, what are those factors that really sort of motivate those existence of those layers and sub-layers? And obviously there are many factors like class factors, caste factors, gender factors, cultural factors, various other factors that exist. So when we get into this, and especially when you walk into this authentic Indian restaurants, by default it is just a very assimilated representation of certain selective northern Indian food items that sort of cater to the tastes of the European colonizers, that sort of made them feel, well, we think this is tasty for us, so this has to be authentic Indian. And that is how it sort of, went around and got transported as authentic Indian foods. So, I mean, when I engage with this whole narrative of decolonization, again, it's like a massive, expansive perspective. There are different dynamics and dimensions to it. I'm just sharing one aspect here, like what exactly happens. And this is where I have a problem with this whole notion of how a sort of imaginative concept of authentic Indian food exists outside India, and especially if you go to parts of Europe and even other parts of the world as well, which is very problematically assimilative in nature, which is extremely exclusionary in nature, and most importantly, a lot of the layers and sub-layers of our palates, of our cultures, of our traditions, of understanding food has been very systemically negated in that process. And we are so celebrative about it. That's a problem. We just leave it as unquestionable right there. That's a problem. So these are some of the avenues that I try to look into, when I engage with this whole dimension of what do we understanding by decolonization of food. Because there are many food items right within the Bengali cuisine sphere where we try to, as children, we have heard that, they're like authentic Bengali cuisine. Like one very common item, I think, probably many of you would be knowing, is what we call a shukto, right? We always say that shukto is one of the authentic Bengali cuisine, but the whole concept of shukto, that is using bitter gourd in the food in Bengali cuisine, were introduced by the Portuguese. Because Portuguese traditionally they have a salad which is made with bitter gourds. They came, they told the chefs something in the Portuguese language. Obviously they didn't understand. They understood something in their own Bengali language. They went to the kitchen. What came out was shukto. Now, when you listen, when you sort of sit down and try to historically, culturally reflect back to this composition of the food, to what extent it is authentic Bengali is actually quite a big question. I think I'll stop here.
May I answer that? I grew up in the UK. The Indian restaurants in the UK are not by British people, so you can't call it decolonization. They're by Bangladeshis, mainly Bangladeshis from Sylhet. They came because they were poor. They had nothing, they had no life back in Bangladesh. They came, a lot of them, and most of them, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, came illegally. They needed to do something. They were not trained, and they opened Indian restaurants. The British, most British, we're talking about this generation. We're not talking about the generation of British that colonized or were in India, had no idea what authentic Indian food was. So their idea of authentic Indian food was what was presented in the curry houses by the Bangladeshis, who also weren't cooks, by the way. They were just people who came who sort of, had to make a living quickly. So when you're talking about authenticity, neither were the poor Bangladeshis authentic, neither was the British who were eating that food and eating what they called a vindaloo, which is a vindaloo, which is not a vindaloo at all, a Madras curry, a korma. None. These were just names. So when you're looking at socioeconomic, it's also important to see where it came from. It's not always from the colonizers. In this particular case, it came from Bangladeshis, in this case. So if you're talking about authenticity, or the Portuguese doing shukto or whatever, I mean, the Portuguese, the British, whoever, have given us, mirchi, we've got chilies. Chilies is so much part of, what would we all do without mirchi today? So mirchi, tomato, potatoes, bengan, everything comes from the colonizers. Those things, I'm not talking about mushrooms or red peppers or whatever, all of those things which are so intrinsically part of our diet. What would the whole of North India do without aloo? Aloo is not indigenous to India. So I agree with you that, we have to examine authenticity, but how long do we go back?
No, no. Can I just respond to that? I don't know. Yeah. Okay. Sorry, you wanted to share something?
I just wanted to say very briefly that what we also have to consider, it's not just colonization, but food also traveled along the spice routes and the silk routes. So, I mean, these trade routes not only had, were they used for carrying goods, but they also carried ideas, they also carried cuisine. So much. To give you a very quick example, Lucknow is in the in the winter we always have something called dahi ka shorba. Dahi meaning yogurt and shorba meaning a soup. And we always thought it was so authentically a Lucknowi dish. Till I went to Turkey for the first time, and then they have yogurt soup, and that's where it had originated from. So there's several examples like this, you know.
No, no, absolutely, and I totally agree with what Karen says. So, just to further clarify my argument on two perspectives, the first is number one is when I talk about those, when I critique those authentic Indian restaurants, I'm specifically critiquing those authentic Indian restaurants that mostly caters to the white taste. Because again, we have different levels and layers of authentic Indian restaurants.
All the restaurants in the UK cater to the white taste. The
Yeah.
Bangladeshi restaurants were not for brown people.
Exactly.
They were
so,
for white people.
Yeah, so that is where I critique the taste. Like, because what are the stories that are getting carried? Again, it's a critique. I mean, it's an observation. I mean, I'm not trying to tell that those restaurants should be shut down, right? But it's just a critique. Like, and my critique is about how this element of decolonization comes, like from my perspective. Because even if a restaurant is owned by a Bangladeshi, I mean, if I'm trying to critique decolonization, it is not just about I'm critiquing the white body. I'm also critiquing the white ideologies that are getting reflected right there. So if I'm, even as an Indian person, if I'm opening up a restaurant, and if my central idea of the audience is the white audience, then obviously I will have a different stance of preparing the food, cooking the food, pricing, and all of these elements as compared to when I cater to the, let's say, a local Indian audience or the touristic Indian audience, or let's say widely the touristic South Asian audience. And so that was my point of critique. But also what you're sharing is absolutely acceptable. So when I talk about decolonization, I'm not just talking about how the white body is sort of appropriated, but also it is how we are schooled in those white ideologies, and we, without questioning, often go out and present our foods in very improper ways. The number two thing is what you were saying about Sunita, is also the spice trade. I mean, absolutely, that's very important in the process of, you know, connecting how foods you know, travel from one another, and that is another major reason why again the whole notion of authenticity is questionable for me, because like the trade routes through the oceans, and you know, that is again so much connected to slavery, so much kind of indentured laborers and plantations and all of those elements, how spices travel from Southeast Asia to India to Africa to the Caribbean to Latin America and across the world, is another element like which sort of invites us to think around that what is exactly authentic food. And again, this invitation is just to be again on a clearer point. This invitation is not to again dismiss the existence of authenticity, but it's in a way we need to be, probably I think, at least with respect to the positionalities and the perspectives of my research, that why this notion of authenticity has to be questioned and rethought and reinterpreted on a continuous basis.
I think there is a very important point that we all should keep in mind after listening to this particular conversations, which is very pertinent to any epistemological terrain. Because when he spoke about the authenticity, the notion of authenticity, we always try to generalize things, because there is always sweeping generalizations regarding any sort of identity. Any sort of identity, let that be national identity, let that be the identity of a particular culture, religion, there are always certain loopholes in every identity. So when we cannot reduce anything into a particular monolithic entity, as since the beginning of the discussion we were speaking about that. And at the same time, we should definitely acknowledge, as Sunita ma'am was rightly pointed out, and Karen ma'am was also pointing out, there are certain the histories of economy, the histories of migration, the stories of culture, transmission, etc., are there. Even before the British colonialism, there were trade engagements. So there were ways in which the culture traveled across borders. Last year we had a discussion on travels across borders. But even before that, even before colonization, there were certain ways like the spice route and silk route, the different kinds of knowledge, the different kinds of ideas were traveling from Europe to Asia and Asia to Europe. So we have to think about all these factors before finalizing or generalizing or reducing a particular diversity into a single notion. From that point, we'll move on to another important aspect that I would love to listen from Karen ma'am, because even in several of your interviews, we are speaking about the lifestyle, health, relation to food, and mindful eating. So I think it will be useful for the audience so that you can share some insights about the idea of mindful eating.
Yeah, we get back to food now and out of politics a little bit. So yeah, people say to me, you know, a lot of the recipes from this book in particular, it's the first book I've done on Indian recipes in a long time. You know, how do people eat heavy Indian food every day? Now, we don't. We eat Gharka Khana, which is not heavy Indian food. But I think one has to be mindful of where we are today. A lot of these recipes, not necessarily from my book, but a lot of traditional recipes demand that you exercise. In 30 or 40 years ago, we had better seeds for our wheat. We had a better quality of vegetables and meat. As you said, Sunita, we all knew organic. You know, organic was not a word. We didn't have to learn it. Today, I think in Kerala, you are very lucky. The quality of your vegetables, the quality of your fish is excellent. In other parts of the country, especially cities, our produce is not so good. So I think you have to be very mindful of what you eat in terms of where you get. You have to be very involved in the sourcing. You know, I have 2 boys who cook and who are, because they've grown up with me. My husband is useless. He doesn't cook at all. He's a great guy, but he doesn't cook. So he's only useless in the kitchen. And often when he says to me, you know, I'll do this or I'll do that or I'll help, he doesn't realize it's not just the cooking. It's the sourcing of the produce. It's not just as where do you get your chicken or where do you get your vegetables. That's also as equally important to me as actually somebody cooking. So I think that mindfulness, the new generation now who is going to be, you know, who are going to be cooking have to understand. You have to be very, very aware of the source of your product. I think that's really important. And also how much of, you know, what we can do if you want to eat something, a biryani or something authentic, eat less of it. You don't have to eat 2 plates of biryani, right? Because we're not going walking to the farm afterwards. So you can still enjoy. There was a fantastic French woman I saw years ago on the Oprah show or something. And they said she was very slim. And she'd written a book called The French Paradox about food and how French women remain very thin even when they eat lots of butter and croissants and things like this. And what she said, very clever, you eat 1 bite. You have the croissant and you have 1 bite and you enjoy it. You have the rasagola and you have 1 bite. You don't have to eat 6. So I think that's really important. You can enjoy the good things of your diet and your life by eating a little of it. You don't have to eat lots of it.
One more thing, ma'am. I think we should also speak about your British friends' experiment on healthy food habits and how the working class was not able to afford the healthy food habits, because that's very important to address that also.
Very quickly. So Jamie Oliver is a very famous chef, and he had in the UK, and he had started a school meals program. And so what he did was he went into schools and made school food, which they were serving in schools, healthy. So all the kids started eating his kind of stir-fried vegetables with Asian ingredients and quiche and all of that. And there was uprising from the parents, because the parents said, you are alienating our children. They come back home and they don't want to eat fish and chips, and they don't want to eat sausages, which are all unhealthy, but they don't want to eat this. They think somehow Jamie Oliver is superior and health food is superior. So it became a kind of political analogy. It was quite dangerous because they saw it as, and they actually made a big plea to Jamie Oliver to stop doing healthy food in schools because it was causing this rift. I mean, I know he did it from his heart, but it was causing a rift between the children who then didn't want to eat the kind of food that their parents were giving them. Not because their parents were doing anything bad, but because they simply couldn't afford. They weren't educated anyway. But this is the working class British meal, is full of carbs. And they really couldn't afford any better food. Neither did they have the education to give them. Luckily, with the working class in India, by and large, if they can afford it, eat quite sensibly. We eat all the groups, you know. We eat good sabzis, we eat wheat, we eat rice. But in England, the food is very processed today, and generally the working class diet is very stodgy, and it's cheap. At the end of the day, it's cheap.
I think that's very important. Another important point that we should all think about, because we live in another nation which is very much which experiences stark inequalities of income and all the intersectional divides of caste, class, and gender, where affordability to healthy food is a dream, is a myth for most of us. Let's take the National Family Health Survey by the central government, where the access to healthy food, the girl child, the health problems of girls in India, the health problems of the underprivileged in India is a very serious issue that we should all think about. While we are discussing about food, we should also think of, when we are speaking about the culture of food, we should also think about the economy of food. And coming back to Sunita ma'am, I know that you are an architect. So how do you think your relation with food, because architectural spaces are very important for the experience of food. So how do you think that an architect, how come an architect become interested in food cultures? So that's something that I would wanted to ask you.
Firstly, I don't think. Firstly, I'm not an architect. My daughter is an architect. I'm an interior designer, and I've done and continue to do architectural conservation work. Uh, Two different things. But why should one lead a compartmentalized life, I think? I mean, I can be an interior designer and yet I can also be interested in food. After all, food is something that is integral to our lives. And speaking from where Karen said, you know, food affects our health, it affects our longevity. And today people are running after, starting from the West, what we have taken for granted, that we eat food that is seasonal, that is locally grown, without somebody else having to tell us that this is what you need to do. I mean, in our country, we do it naturally. So therefore, if my mother passed away at 96 and a half, she was following the way her mother had also grown up. And earlier I had just mentioned that if 96 and a half was very important because when the first cookbook had come out, she'd written a first book on Anglo-Indian food from Lucknow, and which had become a bestseller, and was all 3 editions were sold out. But we had been invited to Calcutta for the Calcutta Lit Fest. And the two, there was mother, myself, and my mother was then 92. And they had somebody called Dr. Pushpesh Pant, who's a very, very well-known food writer, apart from the fact that, he's a genius because he did his first dissertation on international relations at the age of 17. And there was another person there called Shahanshah Mirza. And Shahanshah Mirza is a direct descendant of Wajid Ali Shah, because as you know, that Nawab of Awadh was thrown out of Lucknow, and he spent his last years of exile in Calcutta. And therefore in Calcutta you have the Calcutta biryani. Khair, that may be as it is. But, after Dr. Pushpesh Pant had introduced us, we were all mic'd up and there were various wonderful people in the audience. So when he asked me something, I said, in answer, I said, yes. And my mother, who's 93, and she just turned around and told me, she says, darling, I'm not 93, I'm 92 and a half. So therefore, I always say that she passed away at 96 and a half. But now, why was she able to do the things that she did? I mean, she was 90 when she traveled to Uzbekistan with me. She was in her late 80s when she wrote her first book, and she negotiated everything with her publishers herself. Much of it has really to do with what we eat. And she always ate nutritionally sound food. So I really think that there is much to be said about eating well, but also eating in a way that you will not get today's lifestyle diseases, like people at 40 in their late 30s getting diabetes or having a heart condition. That is all, now it has been established that it is all directly related to that we eat what we are. Or rather, we are what we eat.
I think, sir, it's time for us to come back to politics again from food. So there is something that we wanted also to include in this discussion. Since the topic is what we eat and our food defines our identity. But are we under a system where we can assert our identity? Are we under a political system where we are allowed to eat what we want to? How do you see, as a critique, as a researcher of food studies, how do you see the contemporary situation?
I think it's a wonderful question in continuation to what both of you shared, because especially in terms of the importance of understanding the value of health and and the question that we keep on negotiating throughout our life, that how do we balance delicious food with health, and what Karen shared, what Sunita shared, I think it also widely connects to the question of politics as well. And especially we are living in a time where every aspect of our existence, every aspect of our taste, even in terms of palates, are also being censored and surveilled by certain political ideologies, certain political entities, certain political perspectives. In the name of religion, in the name of spirituality, in the name of problematic notions of purity, and so many other various highly questionable dimensions and dynamics. So in that sense, I think it's important really to be very vocal about the whole politics of taste. I mean, politics of taste has always been there. It is always there even if you take the good sides, the brightest sides of our food taste as well, there is a politics. But when I'm trying to specifically focus on the notion of the politics of taste, is what I'm trying to being very specific of the contemporary times, where certain political institutions are dictating vegetarianism on us, certain political institutions are dictating veganism on us, certain political institutions are telling us which particular meat we should consume, which particular meat we should not consume. And again, the purpose of saying this is not to try to sit on a binarized space and tell people what is good and what is bad. We all have our own choices. We can be vegetarians, we can be vegans, we can just have fish, we can just have meat. But the problem lies is when somebody comes and dictates our palate, dictates our sensorial pleasures, sensorial desires, and tell us what is good for us and what is bad for us, without really considering our viewpoints. And sadly, that is what is happening. I can be critical about somebody's tastes, but I have no right to be dismissive of somebody's tastes. I can taste a certain food item and tell that I didn't like this food item. It's fine. But I have no right to tell, just because I didn't like this food item, so it should be thrown out, rejected, cancelled. But unfortunately and sadly, that is happening. And since, as I said, as on the one side I work on the elements of decolonization, but simultaneously I also do engage with this whole political, implementations, this political impositions of food. And it is happening across the country. It is happening across restaurants. Where certain restaurants, because they were just selling beef or they sell beef products, they are just being stoned and banned and shut down, right? Or certain restaurants, I mean, just see the uncriticality. I mean, this is something which I widely connect to, that no matter whatever we do, we have to be critical and reflective of what we see and what we engage with. I mean, it happened in Hyderabad. Just the name of the shop is Karachi Bakery. They just stoned it and broke it. I mean, just imagine the level where we have reached, the level of nonsense, the level of uncriticality, the level of blindfoldedness where we have reached, that we have stopped questioning. We have stopped understanding the value of questioning. And I think the whole set of conversations, I mean, again, three of us are coming from three very different vantage points for sure, but I think three of us very much, including your questions and reflections, I'm sure would kind of invite all of us here is, let's not accept. I mean, it's fine. I mean, if everybody in this audience tells me that I don't accept with anything, as you say, it's absolutely fine. No one has to accept. But the problem would be if somebody says that I dismiss you because I just don't accept you. That would be a problem for me. And that is something which also I would like to focus on, stress on, when I engage with the question of the politics of food. Thank you so much.
Just one sentence. I think you brought up something which has been the most important facet of this conversation, because there is so much politics in food. We won't even go into how caste has played such an important aspect in food. There is so much that these are very important points. They are not being debated today because people are also afraid. I mean, the organizers have put me up in a hotel called the Hyatt Regency, and looking at the room service menu, I was absolutely surprised that, they've got beef's curry and they've got beef something and beef. Nobody's burned down the hotel is what surprises me. If this were to happen in the north, that edifice would not exist.
Actually,
You actually couldn't write it. In Maharashtra, we can't write the word beef. On any menu, they do serve buff, and you have to write tenderloin. So it's not a question of, I mean, at least here it's open and the choice is there. But in Maharashtra, for example, we can't write it on a menu.
we actually, all the four of us are sitting in a state which used food spaces like food practices like Misra Bhojanam or Pandi Bhojanam, where the people of different castes sit together to subvert the notions of caste purity. We speak this from a state which is always dismissed all kinds of impositions regarding food. So I think this is a place where you can freely open up, and as you were mentioning inside, this is a place where we can freely talk about any politics of food. I think the audience will contribute much to the understanding of the politics of food from Kerala.
Yeah, it's true that Kerala is at least a little bit more sane about food right now than many other parts of the country. And one of the things that comes to mind is the IITs. I studied in one myself in Delhi. In 75 to 80, I was in IIT Delhi. And we weren't given non-veg food every day. In those days, I was a non-vegetarian. We was just served non-veg once a week. So the non-veg people, it was just, egg curry or something. It would be kept in little things. And the others, I think, got paneer. And so you just got your little thali or whatever, katora of thing. You came to the table, you sat with your friends who were veg or non-veg or whatever, and you ate it. Now, recently in IIT Bombay, one group of ultra vegetarians have said they cannot sit with anybody who eats non-veg. And IIT administration has agreed to give them a separate little space or something like that, where they will. So this is tied up with caste. It is tied up with a lot of issues which are making a big resurgence. I've just finished the biography of a physicist called Anna Mani, who was C.V. Raman's student. And those days there were very few women in IISc, Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore. But the men, there were quite a few. The men had Iyer messes and Iyengar messes, and they made a big thing about what they ate and who they would eat with and all that. The women, there were a few of them, they all stayed in one house and they just ate, and whoever ate what, it was quite cool. It wasn't a big deal. So we are making a big, we are going backwards in many ways, and that's something I wanted to say. Yeah.
So what I have to say is, even in food, there are caste discriminations. Like, people won't eat from a family who's from a lower caste, who comes from a lower caste. If there is any functions, people just avoid the food section, saying it's made by a lower caste family. That's what Indian practices. Even in my house, my grandma follows this. So once I used to question her, but now I know there's no use for questioning old people. They won't change literally. So what's your opinion on that?
Well, I don't believe in it at all. And I think the sooner, I don't even want to say what caste I am. Because, but in our house, for instance, for instance, our cook of 27 years is a Muslim. I'm a practicing Hindu. So forget about the caste system. Not allowed. And I think anybody who is educated should not abide by it. That is my very, very firm opinion.
Yeah, thank you so much for your question. I will first of all tell you I really loved your term ultra-vegetarianism. It's such a wonderful metaphor to cover a lot of things without being censored and, sort of found out. And, connecting with this point and also your question, see, it's sometimes very difficult to explain certain perspectives because, again, there we have to see the generations where we emerge from. Again, I'm not trying to generate any hierarchies in that perspective, but also it's also a lot about the generational schooling, right? Like in the current times, we have more exposures to a lot of these critical spaces through social media and a lot of dimensions. Obviously, in your grandmother's times, in my grandmother's times, it was not there. So a lot of times it's very difficult to sort of go there and try to sit and explain them. Rather, it's best to perform what you want to resist and just to present it as that whatever you say, this is what I believe in and this is what I'll do. So I think at points of time, that whole performance of, resistance is very important. And again, that also has its own challenges, but also what, like Sunita rightly shared, in connection to that, it is also, rather than going into a lot of these verbal questionings and conversations, it is that performance of the resistance which has historically made more impact than verbal conversations. So that could be one possible way, of sort of presenting your perspectives and ideologies and not really abiding by what is being imposed on you.